So good afternoon. It's actually it's a pleasure being here, and so my next 30 minutes is really going to be around why do we always look at certain trends isolated, where the big opportunity is when you actually combine them. So that's why I call this talk the opportunity when technology trends converge. And I'm going to talk about 4 trends, but not in isolation, but really when they get together. It's about mobility, mobile devices, it's about social, it's about big data, and also the cloud. So take one of the more dominant, used to be startups, Spotify. Spotify gives you apps on literally all devices. They use the cloud to distribute music to your app, to your device. They actually leverage social networks to give you a recommendation, and they use big data to do actually some number crunching, or better to say music crunching, to make you most suitable music recommendations. I think if you want to build tomorrow's apps, just focusing on the device is really wrong. It's not just wrong because you're not delivering on what you could actually deliver, but it's also you limit yourself to a business model which is predominantly based on someone shopping either at an app store or you go into ad-based models. However, if you really want to monetize on a service delivery, you need to have a backend there. And that's really the conversation I would like to have. And if you look around, this is really kind of a shift in modern architectures. So we're actually not talking about front ends and back ends. So we really talk about devices and services. The one thing which makes this a little bit more complicated is that devices change quite frequently. I mean, just think about, you're going to have a device which has a contract with an operator. And you're going to get a new device in either 1 or 2 years. So the turnaround of devices is every second year. 100% of the devices are going to get replaced, but most likely even faster. So focusing on the device might be not the right strategy, because there is something more important, more stable, which is the service on a back end. Take, for instance, Xbox. Xbox is just one device, but it actually comes with a service, Xbox Live. And we are also using big data to do some analysis of how players are using the game, so we can actually make some predictions about that stuff. I know gaming, so basically a mobile gaming company, they use a service backend to predict how they can increase in-app purchases, to make some data analysis on a backend to see how people behave and whether they think it's okay to buy an additional option or not. And this is only done if you think about it more holistically. So not just the app, but also a service which actually outlives the device, because we're all going to change them quite frequently. So the 3 things I would like to talk about, and I really see this as not isolated opportunities, but really things that get together, is the first is the world is at your fingertip. The cloud fundamentally changed your customer base, so the people you can address, but it also changed the investment that you need to its positive. The second one is, I do believe it is not about the device. I believe it is about the experience that I have across all my devices. So it's about the apps, it's about the data, but most importantly, it's about me, the user. Because devices are going to change. And then the last one is, data gives you insight. It gives you a lot of insight. And if you know how to deal with it, it can give you a tremendous competitive advantage. And I would actually even go that far and say, data science is the next rock and roll. So we're going to talk about this as well. So let's talk a little bit about cloud first. It is really important to understand that it is a new design point. It is cloud first. If you have a solution which is written with an old thinking in mind, it's very hard to actually benefit from the capabilities that the cloud gives you. Especially the #1 capability, the cloud democratizes access to scale and reach. Just internalize this. You do not need to have money to have a customer base across the globe. And you do not need to have a lot of money to actually serve all of them. So now there are two ways to look at this. Your customers are global, and the other one is your competition is global too. Let's reflect a little bit on this. In the 1970s, to forecast weather, so basically to run a weather model and get a weather forecast, we actually used something which was called Cray 1, so one of the first supercomputers, and it cost $5 to $8 million US. So no one of you could actually do something similar to weather forecasting, except you were very, very wealthy or you found some great investors. So this was basically just for institutions. Today, we actually just did it as a demo on Windows Azure. We run a weather forecast in the cloud. So you see, I just run one for Kiev, which just shows the vapor there. So everyone can do it. So that has been completely democratized. So my ask to you is, when you think about possibilities, really think out of the box. A lot of the way we think has been influenced by older technology. So it is cloud style. So what does this mean? If you build solutions, you have to actually write these solutions that they can scale out. The whole cloud is based on scale out, which means you have to write your solution in a way you can partition your data across multiple nodes. You need to think about how you can actually aggregate from other data sources, like in a weather forecast, we took publicly available weather data. So it's like service orientation in the large. But the most important thing is, if you actually build a service, you are in the business of service delivery and not software development. Service delivery means you have a service level agreement with your customers, which is fundamentally different than just shipping a piece of software to someone. I would actually say, if you do it right, if you have the right architecture in place, your level of abstraction is actually the data center and not the server anymore. So this is what we are saying with platform as a service versus infrastructure as a service. You just deploy your application and you just tell whether it's data center Northern Europe, whether it's a data center in Western Europe, whether it's one in Asia, and that's it. That's the level of abstraction. You do not care about network configuration, load balancers, virtual machine patching, and so forth. Do you see the opportunity there? You can actually focus on the things that really bring value, which is your solution, your service. And then deployment, it just means you deploy it to a data center, not to an individual server. That really brings me to the second portion, which is around the experience that we have on apps. So who plays Angry Birds? Oh. Okay. Do you know why I stopped playing Angry Birds? No, not because I was bad on it. Huh? Yes. And what happened? I changed the device. I don't mind buying the app again for $3, but I do not want to play the levels again. Do you get the point? They don't know who I am. They don't care who I am. It's the worst, seriously, the worst experience if you change devices. And I'm not even talking about from one device platform to the other. I'm just saying you change your device. You know, obviously Rovio can do this because they still make a lot of money and they don't need to support all the platforms. That is fine. I would say the majority of us in our businesses of a certain size would be dead if we lose a customer when he actually changes the device. Because I was just saying 50% of the people change the device every year. So you would lose 50% of your customer base. Does this make sense? Scary, isn't it? And still, most of the apps I have on my device don't know who I am, have no clue who I am, don't roam data from one device to the other, they don't care. And they don't know who my friends are. I mean, this is seriously the most obvious lost opportunity in the current app space. So that's why I'm saying it is not about the device. It's about the apps, the data, and the user. And the user. You need to know who someone is. Otherwise, you're never going to exploit the max out of your app. Now, that was more on the consumer side. Now, think about commercial. So if you're building apps or solutions towards organizations, this is a tremendous opportunity where actually we have now new work styles. And what I mean with this is, I live in Switzerland, but I've been more to our Singapore office than to our Zurich office. And by the way, I've only been in the Singapore office last year 4 times. I can work wherever and whenever I want. But I only can do this if I have the right tools in my hand. So a lot of people talk about bring your own device. So people bring their own devices into organizations. And Gartner just says by 2017, half of the employers will require employees to bring their own device. Now that is funny. Will require. Now the question is, do they actually give them money to do so? Yeah, you're laughing. But it's the reality. There are already situations out there where if you do not have the right device, you do not get the job. Because bring your own device. Now, this is actually a tremendous opportunity, again, if you think about this from a startup perspective, or just if you have a great idea. Bring your own device means people bring their own apps to work. Now, if it's not just an app, but you also have a service on the back end, they actually bring their own cloud to work. Which means you now suddenly can sell into large organizations and completely bypass IT. Just reflect on this opportunity which is out there. It's again not about the device. It's about you being able, providing a software as a service solution that also has apps that basically connect seamlessly through data that knows who the user is, maybe even authenticating it with Active Directory because that's used among most organizations. Tremendous opportunity. So it's not about the app, it's really about the end-to-end solution. It's about devices and services. And I think that's where it is fundamentally wrong how people approach bring your own device. I would actually say, why would I need to bring my device to my workplace when I already have a device there? Why would I work and email with my phone if I have in front my PC? So the interesting portion is devices are extremely useful when you're actually not in the office. So all the scenarios where you're not in the office, when you can do stuff without being connected to a corporate network, which then again means the perimeter is gone. There is literally no corporate network anymore, which again means you can sell solutions to fairly large organizations without going to IT, but really directly going to business. But only, and I just repeat myself, only if you're focusing on apps, data, and the user. What that means in a commercial space, you need to be able to provision data. Provision data, I mean only certain people are allowed to see certain data. You need to ensure that you're compliant with a certain industry. But if you do this on a service backend, if you use, authentication, and you use actually, for instance, Active Directory to do so, everything is at your fingertip. And we, for instance, have Active Directory on Windows Azure for free in the cloud. So you can actually bring Active Directory to small hairdresser shops and really run that stuff without installing it and go through the hassle of maintaining it. Which really means we need to change the way we think about apps and applications. I do understand that there are certain areas, especially around gaming, where there is still a lot of money to be made on apps. I think it is actually much better if you can monetize it on a service level, because this is continuous revenue. So really focusing away on selling a one-off thing towards continuous revenue on a service level. And that's what you see with many of the games taking place anyway, with in-app purchases, where you, for instance, can buy time, so stuff builds faster. So think about your modern apps are kind of your marketing muscle. They should be free. They should be available on all the platforms. Like Spotify. Why would Spotify charge you for downloading the Spotify app? Spotify monetizes on this music service on the back end. So if you build these modern apps, just be aware of that the devices we have today, the capabilities of these devices, is certainly not the same than in a year. And even if someone thinks that Android, iOS, Windows, BlackBerry market share is the same in 3 years, I would challenge that particular person seriously. Because that would be exactly that person that wouldn't have told me 3 years back that we had a 79% market share of Android. This is because this turnaround of devices gets exchanged every second year the least. No other device business has similar conditions around there. And also, we're actually entering new markets. So if you go, for instance, into lower price markets, like take Africa, take some parts of Asia, there is a different dynamic on what devices suits their needs as well. And then we have different connection capabilities and different form factors. They might merge, we might get new stuff. What happens if there are wearable devices? So what happens if in 3 years we're actually not having a mobile phone, but that whole stuff is built into my shirt? So where is your market share of 79% then? No one knows. Because we don't know at the moment what is going to be the platform we're building these type of solutions on. So my advice here really is develop apps for very specific capabilities, whether the form factor capability or the connection capability. And certain devices are more personal than others. So a phone is a very personal device. An iPad is a less personal device that you just leave around and that your whole family can play around. So think about this as well. And then it is really that one person has many devices. Ignoring this fact, like Rovio does on Angry Birds, is just wrong. The way Spotify does is just brilliant. So I have 3 devices back home. They all have Spotify installed. They're all running on different platforms. I can all go offline with them. They know who I am. By the way, that's an interesting thing. Do you know how they know who I am? So early versions of Spotify used username and passwords. So now I can give you my username and password because it's only for Spotify, so I don't care. So they moved away from this. What do they use now? Facebook, yeah. Do I give you my Facebook username and password? Maybe not. You see a point there? So if you are in consumer app space, use one of the existing authentication providers and use open authentication. So whether you're going to use the Twitter accounts, whether you're going to use a Microsoft account, whether you use a Google ID or you use a Facebook ID. These are IDs no one is sharing. So which really means you know to whom you're talking to, and if a second person in the family would like to listen to that music service as well, then they actually buy a second subscription. So it is important to have the person in the center, and then the devices and the apps and the data that belongs to the person just flows seamlessly. And then don't forget, you need to have rapid life cycles in place. As I was saying, market share can shift, new devices come along, what happens when we have wearable devices. And we call this continuous delivery. Some of the companies I'm working with, they actually deploy their service solutions 98 times a day. So what does this mean? They have automated build, automated test, and automated deployment. Which means they can fix a bug, it gets automatically built, tested, and if the test is okay, it gets deployed, and it's out there maybe in 4 or 5 hours without someone pressing a manual button. Something you need to have when you're actually going into the service business. Which really brings me now to the last point, and this is, I think, where there is pure gold. I mean, data, we're just scratching on the surface. And we talk a lot about the buzzwords, but reflecting on the opportunity is just not done enough. And that's why I'm saying it's the next rock and roll. If you want to become a superstar, data science might be a good area to focusing on. Manchester City. So what you see here, it's fascinating. Manchester City is one of these examples. They collected a lot of data. Every single player with a geolocation and whether he passes forward or backward. They didn't know what to do with this data. So they published it on the web. And it was a fan who created this heat map where you see different player types, the color, and then you see whether they're passing forward or backward. So blue is the goalkeeper, so he only passes forward. Everyone else passes forward and backward. So it gives them data, statistical data to analyze their players and compare and benchmark it. But the funny thing is, it wasn't Manchester City who came up with this. It was actually crowdsourced by a fan. Unfortunately, they realize now how powerful this is, and they took it off the web. So why are we like this? It's like the supercomputing thing, you know, where you had to have a very rich institution or even a government. We still have this mindset that storage is expensive. So look, in the 80s, 10 megabyte hard drive costed $3,398. Today, we have geo-redundant storage. That means 1 gigabyte stored is actually stored in 2 locations. In each location, it's stored 3 times, which means 1 gigabyte is actual 6 gigabyte physical storage on Windows Azure. Now, if we would have done this 30 years back, we would have required 600 disks, which are roughly $2 million. Even if you get a 50% discount, it's $1 million. So that's why, you know, traditionally storing stuff for a long time was something we just haven't done because it was expensive. If you now look at Windows Azure, you can actually store this 6 times, so geo-redundant for 0.095 dollars per gigabyte per month, which means you can store a gigabyte of data over 5 years for $6. This is such a radical change that suddenly everyone talks about big data. But what is big data? So is everyone clear in here what big data is? Okay. Do you know what's the smallest big data problem? Yes? No, I mean, the smallest big data problem is if you can't store it in one location. Then you run into a big data problem, the smallest one, but because you kind of need to know, is it on node A, is it on node B, and node C? So forget about big data in the terabytes, big data or even in the petabytes. Big data is a way to abstract the complexity of storing. So the step one of every big data project or effort is just store. Don't think, store. Someone else takes care. You know, you don't need to know which disk. The platform does it for you. Store. Store. So who of you stores every single weblog? I'm not saying you strip it first, storing the raw weblogs. Who of you? None? Which means you're only going to be as smart in the future as you thought you're going to be. Because everything else you threw away. So if you extract stuff, you already limit your knowledge in the future to what you thought it's going to be good 10 years back. That should be your first real takeaway from big data. Don't throw stuff away. You might become smarter. Or someone else gives you hints what would be interesting in your data source. And once you have that, we get into step two. Because you stored a lot of data, you can't move that around. So you have to move compute to the data. And that is exactly what Hadoop does. The two major things of Hadoop is HDFS, Hadoop Distributed File System, which allows you to store a lot of data without knowing what disks. And it gives you MapReduce, which basically is an algorithm which allows you to run queries in a highly parallel fashion across all these nodes. Hopefully you get a better understanding now where the real opportunity of big data is. Storing, and then in the future, finding out maybe some brilliant stuff. Because data gives you only the what. It are the people. The people tell you why. Let me show you this. And now we're getting into this data science stuff where I think that's going to be a tremendous opportunity in the future. People who understand how to really do data science on big data and correlate things. So in London, it's 1850, there was a cholera outbreak. And there was a new physician, very young one, who actually thought this is not an airborne, but a waterborne disease. So what did he do? He actually had his a thesis. And then he started to plot on a map the outbreaks. Once he had this, he plotted the second data source. Now you start to understand you always need to correlate. And if you throw certain stuff away, you might never get to the second data source, which are the water pumps. And it became very clear that everyone around, or all outbreaks, were actually around this Broad Street water pump. But that would be too nice, because there were actually some noise in the data. So there were some outbreaks in the south, and there were some abnormalities in the brewery, which really means the people in the brewery, they didn't have any cholera, but the people in the south, they had. So this is the data he has. And now he starts talking to people. And I was Reverend Henry. And Reverend Henry knew the people. And he told him, look, the people from the south of Soho, they actually bring kids to the north to school. And on the way back, cling, they take the water from the Bond Street water pump. And guess what? The people working in the brewery didn't drink water because they drank beer. And they had their own water pump as well. So combining all that stuff makes sense, and they could clearly point out that cholera was a waterborne disease. So today, for instance, if you use tools like PowerView in Excel, it allows you to overlay data on top of geographical maps. So what you see here is you could actually now have a graphical view on your usage of your service because you know who people are, you might know where they live, and then you see certain peaks. You see that one person might actually act as a core evangelist for your solution. You might realize that you're actually selling much better in the northern part of the street than the southern part, and you might correlate this with additional data. If you threw away your weblog information, you're never going to get there because most likely that data has been thrown away. So now I was talking about the democratization of scale and reach. I talked about it's not the device, it's really the app, the user, and the data. And then I talked about how we can deal with data to get some real insight that can be a complete game changer. So the next 2 minutes, I really would like to cover what's next. So what's the next super trend? Any ideas? So what's next after social, cloud, big data, mobile? You get to an interesting part. My take on it, just make that stuff more intelligent. I mean, imagine all the devices we have out there. They have so much data. If they can, for instance, help a physician to make a diagnostic much easier, you know, about your broken leg or whatever, because it's nothing else than we have data. But what we should start doing is actually predictive analysis. Start making predictions based on the data that we have. An example of this is, for instance, Bing. So if you search a flight New York to LA, it's not only telling you how much the flight costs, but it is also telling you, my tip is buy it, because there is actually a chance, an 80% chance that there is going to be a $50 increase, all based on data that we already have. So it's predictive and analysis is one of the things I really believe can be a complete game changer. And even in your fitness example, I can give you a predictive analysis of how much weight you're going to lose if you run around this spinning. It's only a prediction, but based on data, maybe fairly accurate. So with this, I really like to thank you to spend the last 30 minutes with me, and hopefully you got some ideas how stuff that converges is much bigger, just individual trends. Thank you.